Okay, this video might be a little long, so I'll spare you a super long intro, but this is a wavetable synth tutorial, and more specifically, a wavetable synth tutorial within Vital, which is free software. So the goal is to kind of teach you the fundamentals so that everything starts looking a little bit more familiar and so that you have the tools to build your own sounds from scratch. Okay, so to start, let's start up here at the voice tab. The voice tab is where all of the sound of the synthesizer is produced. And despite the fact that it looks a little complicated, it's really simple if you break it down into small steps. Okay, so the first and most important part of the entire synth is right here, oscillator 1. To put it simply, an oscillator is what makes noise. So all noise and sound are waves. In fact, right now my voice is actually a bunch of sound waves vibrating from my vocal cords. And so at its core, this is what a synthesizer emulates. It creates an alternating wave that produces sound just like a human voice does with vibrations, except it does it digitally. The most basic type of sound wave is a sine wave. A sine wave is most basic because it only has one frequency. Any other sound that you can possibly hear is comprised of multiple different frequencies stacked on top of each other. So again, if we go back to my voice has actually an indefinite number of frequencies. That is to mean infinite. So if you were to think of yourself as a sine wave, then I guess your cousins would probably be the square, saw, and triangle waves. And that's because those are also all the basic waveforms along with a sine wave. They each have their own unique sound and timbre, and we already established that the sine wave is the most basic and clear waveform, which makes sense because, as you can see, it's smooth and round. Saw waves are the exact opposite. They're characterized by their jagged appearance and their sharp sound. Square waves are square, and they kind of can be described as being a little crushed or distorted. Finally, we have triangle waves down here, and they're bright and clear but still have a sharpness to them, which makes them good for lead instruments. So you have access to all of these oscillators right here in the oscillator section. So everything that I just explained about waveforms applies to all synthesis, so not just Vital or not just wavetable synthesis. And as a matter of fact, I haven't even touched on the actual wavetable element of Vital yet. So for some context, wavetable synthesis is a type of digital synthesis, and it was created in the early 80s. The concept behind wavetable synthesis was to make a complex wavetable in a waveform instead of a basic waveform like a saw, sine, or square wave. And so a wavetable is essentially a series of these basic waveforms that have been chopped and spliced together to make a longer and more detailed and unique wave. And then the goal is that you can kind of scan through this like sort of Frankenstein wave and you can get a really unique and evolving sound. I know that sounds a little complicated, so let me just show you. So for simplicity's sake, I have a sine wave booted up here, but it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, we're going to be making our own sounds. What does matter is that you're going to click this little pencil icon down here. I like to set this to here. Make sure this is set to waveform blend. I have a sine wave up here, which you can see by its shape. And remember, a sine wave is the most basic waveform. It has no harmonics. That's why it just has one bar here. This is the fundamental frequency. But you can add more harmonics by dragging along this row right here. And as you add more harmonics, you can tell and hear the sounds and the frequencies going upwards. So it sounds like this. And obviously that goes on for a while. At a point, you can't really hear it because it gets pretty high, but that's what that bar does. Okay, so once I've reset them all down here, I can show you what the second bar does, which is phase. I'll introduce what phase is later, but all you really need to know is that it shifts the position of the waveform, as you can see here. It's just shifting, it's keeping the waveform the same, but just shifting it. Hopefully you kind of get the idea here, and you can kind of make whatever funky shape you like, and alter the phase, and alter the frequencies up here, and create some really interesting and unique sounds. Now remember, wavetable synthesis isn't interesting because you can create funny looking waves. It's interesting because you can make a bunch of them and scan through them and scrub through them. So in order to do this, we need to make use of keyframes. There's some pre-installed keyframes here, which I'll just go ahead and delete. But you create a keyframe by right-clicking down at this area. You can create a keyframe. And what a keyframe does is you can click on it and then draw in whatever, I'll just draw in a random shape, whatever shape and wave you like. And you can click back to the first one and it saves them. So I have my sine wave and my weird custom wave over here. So now I can move these these keyframes to different ends, and I can go over here and I can scrub through them, and you can see up here in the graph, you can see the morphing going on and taking place, and you can also see it in these rows. Now you can also hear it if you let me play it for you right now. That's kind of what it sounds like. Okay, so maybe you get the picture. You can create as many keyframes as you'd like, just by creating more down here. You can make whatever waveforms you like within these keyframes and space them out however you like. As soon as you have as many keyframes and waves that you like, you can exit the waveform or the wavetable editor up here by clicking on this X, and it'll bring us back to the voice tab. Okay, so now we can utilize this slider right here to see that morphing going on that we just made within our wavetable. I like to click on right here to make this 3D, which looks cooler, but it also maps out the path of the waveform as it's traveling, which I think makes it a lot easier to visualize exactly what's happening and where I am on the path of my wavetable. And of course, this can all get really complex, and you can add a great number of wavetables and automations, and we'll get into that later, but eventually you can make this scroll automatically to really get your own unique and evolving sound wave. So as I'm sure you can tell, there's so much room for creativity and experimentation within your own wavetables. Now, if you can, imagine that times 3. There are 3 oscillators down here. They each do the exact same thing that I've just shown you on oscillator 1. So you can turn it on and off these just by clicking up here. So you can layer and stack sounds to really hone in on the specific sound or texture that you really want. You might have noticed that below these oscillators there's a sampler. The sampler can play any type of audio sample that you drag into it, and it'll kind of play on top of these oscillators or whatever oscillators you have active. And it's super useful in creating textures or giving depth to a sound, which might be very well needed. Okay, now that I've overwhelmed you with all that possibility, I'm going to introduce some more controls, and hopefully once I explain everything on this tab, we can start connecting the dots and things will start making a little more sense. So on each oscillator, there are the basic controls to the left. These include level and pan. Level is also known as volume, and I really hope you know what volume is already. But in case you don't know what pan is, it's where the sound is placed in your headphones from left to right. For example, if this was panned all the way to the left, all of the sound would be played in your left headphone and none in your right, and vice versa. And also on the basic controls, there's coarse pitch in semitones, and there's fine tune in cents. So that's going to sound like this. And then you might have also noticed down here where it says filter 1, that's actually the sends, and so the signal is being sent to filter 1, which is right down here. Filters filter sound. More specifically, it filters away the sound and only leaves the part that are in orange down here. Up here, there's a lot of different types of filters, and I encourage you to try them all. They all have really interesting and unique sounds, and you can really get specific with them if you like, but I'm just going to be doing the basic. So the slider on the top changes it from a low pass to a high pass. In case you don't know, a low pass filter cuts these high frequencies and keeps the low, and a high pass filter cuts the lows and keeps the highs. The slider on the right side controls resonance. Resonance, you can see, is a boost right here, right before the cutoff, which is right here. Resonance can really add like kind of a sharper sound and make things a little more clear in your mix. And then at the bottom, this is cutoff. So that controls how much high or low end you get before the sound's cut off. So right here, I'm getting more high end, and right here, I'm just getting mostly low end. It's kind of the main control on the filter. Down here, there's also a drive knob, which adds saturation. And saturation is essentially just kind of a warm type of distortion. So depending on what sound you want. There's also a mix knob, which affects how much the signal is being impacted by the filter. So for example, if the mix was set to 50%, then 50% of the mix is going to the filter, and 50% of it is coming just straight from the oscillator and bypassing the filter. Okay, the last knob is key tracking, which is kind of complicated, but essentially it adapts the filter to what pitch is being played on the keyboard. So for example, the higher up the note you play, the more open the filter gets, which kind of leads to a more sharp sound as you go up the keyboard. You can kind of see that movement in that filter right there. You can also set this all the way down to -100, which opens up the filter more the lower down you go. And then lastly, and most importantly, we have these buttons right here, which control the routing of the filter. So if the oscillator here is orange, that means it's being sent to the filter. And so as you can see, I can route all 3 oscillators and the sampler to the filter. And I can also route it to filter 2. This is filter 2 right here. It's the exact same thing as I've just told you. It's just duplicated in order to give more customization to which oscillators are being sent to which filter. So you can chain filter 1 to filter 2, or chain filter 2 to filter 1, depending on what you want. So essentially you can filter a filter, or yeah, that would mostly be what you're doing if you're filtering another filter. Going back to the oscillator controls, we can now look at the right side, which is a little bit more complicated. So first, let's look at unison. Unison essentially duplicates the sound wave on top of each other to give a more wide and rich sound. So for example, right now I have one voice of unison, which is just one sine wave. But if I were to increase that to 5, now I have 5 sine waves playing at the same time, which are all slightly panned and detuned, which widens the sound. And speaking of detuning, that's exactly what this is right here. This is the detune percent. The more detuned it is, the wider it sounds, and the more cohesive and I guess even it gets. So you'll kind of notice there's a sweet spot, and also it sounds a little better if I were to give an example with a saw wave. You can really hear that difference. Okay, and then right next to unison controls are the phase controls. Okay, so this is where I'll explain phase, which is a little complicated, so I'll try and explain it the best I can. So phase, like all sound, relates to math. So remember how we talked about sine waves before? So one cycle is 360 degrees. So that means in a sine wave, repeated like this, 360 degrees, or one cycle is this much. So now imagine we have 2 sine waves playing in sync at the same time. They follow the same path and the sound is the same. But if we were to shift that second wave 180 degrees, the path would look like this. Now, since these waveforms are inverse, if I were to actually play that audio, it would be silent, and that's because the waves cancel each other out. This is known as phase cancellation. So whenever we have a change of phase in one waveform against another, we have a new wave when they're added, because all of the differences in phase are added and subtracted from each other. So that's why we got silence from 2 opposite waves, and that's why a sine wave would get twice as loud if you stacked another copy on top of it with no phase. So that's kind of what this control does right here. It shifts the position of the waves, and we hear different variations of phase cancellation throughout the notes. So the knob below phase this is the wave morph knob. This has a lot of potential to do some really interesting things, but at the basic level, it kind of just morphs the shape of this waveform right here. So for example, if I were to set this to squeeze and shift it, you can see it's physically squeezing or stretching that sine wave right there. This last control is spectral morph, and like wave morph, this alters the waveform you have here, but it can usually add a lot more harmonics and mess with the sound a little more. And each setting down here does something really different, so I encourage you to experiment and try it out. Okay, so by now we've kind of covered essentially all there is on this left-hand side of the synth, so now we can start moving over here to the right. So starting up at the top, you may notice that this graphic right here lights up every time we play a note. You can see it right there. This is envelope 1. So envelope 1 is the volume envelope, otherwise known as the amplitude envelope. So the y-axis right here is for volume, and this x-axis is for time. This allows you to make a shape and pattern for the volume to follow as you hold the note. So right here, these knobs do control this shape. So the delay knob controls how long after pressing the key before the note actually plays. You can see a shift right there. Attack controls how quickly the sound goes from nothing to full volume. You can kind of hear it like that. Hold, that control changes how long the note is held at its peak loudness before it decays. And then the decay knob determines how long it'll take after hitting peak loudness to drop to the sustain value. And the sustain value is the loudness maintained as long as you're holding the note down. So for example, if the sustain was at 100% like it is right now, as long as I press and hold this, the note will be at full volume. This can just hold on forever. However, if I were to decrease this to like 50-ish, Now when I hold it, it starts at 100% and lowers to 50. Okay, and then finally release. Once you let go of the note, release is triggered, so then it controls the amount of time before the volume is set back to 0. So basically this envelope can determine whether you have a pad or a pluck or anything in between really. So it can kind of sound like this. Or if I increase the attack, that's usually for more pads and sustain as well. So really, you can get really creative with these envelopes. So now we can scroll our eyeballs down to this LFO tab right here. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. So in other words, it creates a wave, just like these oscillators over here, except this one's slower and you don't hear the wave, but its movement is chained to other parameters in order to give them movement over time. Let me just show you how that works. So when I play a note, the LFO oscillates like this. You can see it moving in that graphic down there. And I can chain that movement by dragging this and putting on anything that's green. So for simplicity of this video, I'll put it to the level or the volume so that you can hear it the most obviously. So it would sound like this. You can see as this moves, the volume gets louder. So as you notice when I drop this, you can see these circles that were placed right here. These circles can determine the direction of the modulation and the strength of the modulation. So for example, if I set it this way, the volume dips before it comes back up. And if I set it this way, it goes up before it comes back down. And of course, this is the range of that volume or the strength of the modulation. Like I said before, remember how I said you can chain the scrolling of this wheel to, you can have it automated? Well, that's how you do that. So you can drag it here, and you can control a circle, which will automate the scrolling of that wheel. So you can get some pretty interesting results there. Now, if I were to change this to a ramp, this knob, it's not represented visually, but the higher up the smoothness is, the more it would connect this high point to this low point down here. And so what that would look like is these corners would really be kind of rounded, and that would be ramped, so that it's a much smoother connection from high to low. And then right next to it is the delay knob. So the delay knob sets a fixed amount of delay right before the LFO starts to kick in. And then the stereo knob right here adjusts and shifts the phase of the LFO, but instead of subtracting and adding each other like they do in the phase control up here, they're offset individually in the right and left headphones, which creates a moving and wider sound. Okay, so the last thing is this area right here, which says trigger. Right now I have it so that trigger means when I press the note, the LFO begins. Which, if I click here, you can see the graphic. But you can move it to things like sync, which will sync with your project BPM, so it'll constantly be going, or other parameters that you like. You can experiment with those. And then frequency adjusts the rate of the movement. So right now I have it set like this, but so I can increase that and it'll move a lot faster. It's up to you and your preference and what you want in your sound design. So you might have been wondering what these extra 2 envelopes do up here. These do something very similar to the LFO that I showed you, and you can chain them to other parameters. Like I said, any parameter in green. The difference is, instead of following the LFO, it'll follow the shape of the envelope that you can create. And so the difference between this and an envelope and an LFO is that when you press and hold a note, the LFO will repeat infinitely, and the envelope will just play through once. And that's also the same reason that there are 3 LFOs down here. That's because you can chain these all to individual parameters to really get a specific sound that you've been looking for. Okay, so right here we have the random generator. The random generator is sort of like an LFO, except that it generates unpredictable and random movements and modulations. So it still follows the tempo, but you can control the frequency down here, but it follows it randomly. And this is super helpful in creating natural movement to make the sound feel a bit less digital. I like to usually put it on fine tune, on the fine tune parameter of an oscillator, and I think it gives it a little bit more like analog warmth. It's pretty subtle. And then we also have 2 random generators in case, like with the envelopes and LFOs, you want to chain them to each different things and get a specific sound. So to the right of the random generator, there are 8 tabs, which you can link to certain parameters. For example, here's the velocity parameter, so I can link that to the level up here. So that would mean the harder I hit the note on my keyboard, the louder the note will play. And that essentially goes for all of these. These all are tied to specific controls within your keyboard. And a lot of them aren't going to mean a lot to you because things like pressure and slide are only on very fancy or specific keyboards. Okay, so we're almost done with this page here. There's just a bit more at the bottom. So where it says voices down here, this controls polyphony. What that means is that, like, if I have this set to 5, that means I can play 5 notes at the same time in a chord. So if I were to try to play 6, the 6th note would not register and so it just wouldn't play. This is helpful because if you're trying to usually make, let's just say, like a bass sound, you only want one note because basses don't play chords. So I can set that to 1 so I can't accidentally play 2 notes at the same time. Okay, so right next to the voices is bend. And so bend only really matters if you have a pitch wheel on your keyboard, and it controls how many semitones the wheel can bend up or down to. And then right here is velocity tracking, which kind of does the same thing as the velocity over here, except instead of being chained to specific parameters, it controls the volume of the entire synth as a whole. So if I turn that up, that means the harder I hit the key, the louder the synth is, and you get the idea. Except you can also set this one to negative 100, which means the softer you press the key, the louder it gets. Seems a little backwards to me, but you could do it. And then there's the spread knob. This adjusts how wide the synth sounds, essentially. So if you turn it up, the sound widens and is spread out between your right and left headphones, and right here it's a bit more unified. Okay, so this last tab can control glide, which essentially allows one note to slide to the next, like this. So the slope over here adjusts kind of the shape of the glide, and the tabs over here choose exactly how the glide is played. So there you go. That's this whole voice tab. So hopefully this looks a lot more manageable now. And after all that, now we can move to the second tab up here, which is the effects tab. So right off the bat, you'll notice all 9 effects that we have in Vital right here that you can access just by clicking the dots. You can turn these on and off just like that, and you can also drag them to reroute the order in the chain of effects. So I'm just going to kind of go down and explain each effect right here in case you don't know. So first on the list is chorus. Chorus slightly detunes your audio in several different copies, which are all delayed and pitch modulated, which creates a really analog and wide sound. And the voices tab right here controls how many copies of the audio there are, and the frequency adjusts how fast the pitch modulation occurs. So that means it controls how fast the sound wobbles, I guess. And then depth controls, I guess, the strength of the wobble, if you're going with that. And then the delay knobs determine how delayed the copies of the audio are. Feedback sends some of this output back into the input of the chorus, which kind of creates a more resonant texture. And cutoff works kind of over here. Cutoff works kind of like a filter, and it allows you to cut high end or low end frequencies. And then spread controls how far panned the voices are from left to right. And finally, the mix right here controls how much of the signal you want to be passed through the chorus. So if it's at 0, it's like this chorus isn't even there, and if it's at 100, all of the signal is passed through the chorus. Moving on, now we have compressor. I'll try and be careful with this one because I think compression is one of the most misunderstood effects. So every compressor is kind of like an automatic volume fader, which is constantly adapting to the signal of your track, and it lowers the highs and shrinks the distance between the peaks and the lows of your signal. So Vital has a multi-band compressor, which you can see with the 3 distinct bands. So this means that the lows, the mids, and the highs are all being processed independently. And also, Vital's compressor is a little special because not only does it lower the peaks, but also brings up the lows. That's why for each column, you see these 2 segments. These segments are the threshold lines, which determines how quiet a sound has to be in order to be boosted, or how loud it needs to be in order to be cut. Over here, the attack knob determines how fast the signal gets boosted or cut, and the release determines how long after being boosted or cut it takes to return back to the normal. And then there's the mix knob, which I'm sure you know what it does by now. Okay, delay. The delay effect is super nice on Vital. Delay can kind of be thought of like an echo. So it takes your signal, waits for a little bit, and then plays it back repeatedly. So it's super versatile, especially in Vital, and you can make it almost kind of like a reverb or it can make it really rhythmic or bouncy. So first of all, you can change the signal from mono to stereo to ping pong, or another type of ping pong. Um, Essentially, the difference is that mono, everything is played through the same through both ears, and on ping pong, it bounces between the left and right ears, while echoing. Over here, we have the frequency, and that affects the rate of the echo, so you can make a short echo or a long and slow. Feedback determines how many echoes you'll hear. So low feedback means that you'll get like 1 to 2 echoes, and then the more feedback you have, your signal will kind of sound like a reverb because the echoes are going to loop over themselves and create a wash. Again, cutoff allows you to cut the highs or cut the lows, and I'm sure you know what mix and spread do by now. Next is distortion. Distortion is pretty self-explanatory. Essentially, it adds harmonics to the signal, so that overdrives the audio and it makes kind of like the signature gritty sound. So right here you can kind of pick the type of distortion, and they're all very different. I'll kind of explain some. So hard clip entirely cuts the peaks of the waveforms at a certain level, which makes the tone very harsh. Soft clip, on the other hand, rounds the peaks, which kind of makes the tone a little bit more smooth and warm. Sine fold uses a sine wave to fold the wave back into each other when it crosses a threshold, which is kind of a crunchy signature sound. There's a lot more here which you should experiment with, and they're all super unique. But the controls really just mostly come down to mix and drive. Drive controls how hard the audio is being pushed into the distortion, so that essentially determines how aggressive it sounds. Or like, which you can barely even hear. And then mix, you know what mix does. And then down here, there's essentially a filter. This is just like the other filter in the voice tab, but this is just if you want to add an extra one on top of your distortion. Okay, EQ. EQ is probably the most important effect of all time, in my opinion, and it's used to shape the sound by cutting or boosting certain frequencies. So the low frequencies represent the bass, and the higher up represent the higher up pitches, I guess. EQ can be super valuable in making sounds be clear or clean. And you don't really need to use the knobs over here. I like to just click and drag to get my desired sound. Above this line means you're boosting these frequencies, and below means you're cutting. So I guess like a little bit of what that could sound like in difference. So I'm boosting the lows, I'm cutting the lows, or I'm boosting the highs, cutting the lows. You can't really tell on a sine wave, but that's what that would be doing. Okay, and then next we have filter. This should look pretty familiar. This is the exact same as the other filters over in the voice tab, but this is just here in case you need more, I guess. Flanger. Flanger is an interesting one. By definition, it duplicates your signal and slightly delays one of the copies by a little bit. And so this delay is just enough to create some strange interactions with phase cancellation. So as a result, the sound is a little bit metallic and hollow, as a rising and falling, like sweeping sound. So offset determines how delayed the duplicate is, and feedback can decide how metallic your sound is. I guess that's how I'd probably describe it. Center determines your baseline delay time, and depth determines how far in and out the signal goes due to phase. And then similarly, we have phaser, which is super similar to flanger, except that it has a different kind of method to create its tone. So instead of duplicating it, it separates the wave into different parts based on frequency, and it misaligns them and then combines the signals again. So this results in like a swooshing sound due to the phase cancellation, and it's a bit more gentle than flanger, but the controls are the same as the flanger tab. Okay, and then finally we have reverb. This is a pretty common effect which mimics playing in a big empty space. So it artificially creates the sound of an audio or a sound bouncing off walls and surfaces in an imaginary room. So I won't go over every setting because we've pretty much covered everything already. And it uses like a combination of other parameters that we've seen. So cutting highs and lows. The most important is going to be time right here because that's going to determine how reverb your signal is. So that goes from to. Okay, and then that'll be all the effects. So of course, you don't need to know all of the specifics. And at the end of the day, your synth is just really whatever you like personally. So mess around with the effects and discover what you like personally. Okay, so next is the Matrix tab, and which sounds a little scary. It's not nearly that bad. Do you remember we chained earlier? Uh, I reset the preset, but we could chain this LFO to, let's just say, the level. This led us to this control, and this control is not only here, but it also shows up in the Matrix tab. That's what that is right there. The Matrix tab essentially just has everything mapped out more clearly in a list. So right now it shows that LFO1 is modulating oscillator 1's level, so the volume. And you can see the amount really easily right here, the morph, and everything that you would want to control, just in a little bit of an easier way to route and to see. Okay, and then the final tab is the Advanced tab. I'm not gonna lie, most of this is pretty irrelevant. You can get this cool analysis graph down here of your signal, which can be kind of helpful. And then also you can change the oversampling over here depending on your CPU and your computer and what it can handle. And then also you can kind of change over here, you can change unison and change all kinds of different things that I don't have activated right now. But yeah, it can get pretty intense, but you don't really need to know all of that to make some sounds. And that's kind of my point is you right now you pretty much have all you need to know. And if I had any advice to give to you, I think it would be not to fall into the trap of just copying presets or following tutorials, because it's a lot more fun to create your own sounds and it's a good learning experience, and they'll end up a lot more intentional and personal if you make them. And I think that's what music is all about. It's about being artistic, and so be artistic and be creative and make your own sounds.